Welcome to Dear SQL DBA, a podcast for SQL Server database administrators. I'm Kendra Little. This week we've got a really fun question about how to tell when a team really knows what they're doing with SQL Server. Here's the question. Dear SQL DBA, when sitting down for the first time with an existing SQL Server, what do you look for as an indication that they know what they're doing? This is along the lines of Van Halen and the brown M&Ms, Perceptive in Pittsburgh. Now, if you're not familiar with the story of Van Halen and the brown M&Ms, Perceptive in Pittsburgh sent a link to an article on Van Halen, and it talks a little bit about their writer that they used when they set up gigs. There's a video, it's a 5-minute video that talks through why in their writer they had this very specific requirement that there be no brown M&Ms backstage. So if you're interested in that, check it out. It's a really fun 5-minute video. I've got the link on littlekendra.com in the blog post for this. This is episode 24. It's essentially kind of signs that there are going to be problems. Like if you show up and you see the brown M&Ms, you know that nobody read the writer and other things may go wrong. So I've looked at a bunch of SQL servers and met the teams that run them a bunch of times, and I've done it a couple different ways. I've done it where I first looked at the SQL server when in an online conference with the team, and there's a webcam right on my face. So people can see me as I'm looking through the SQL server and uncovering things, and I have a little bit of a game face, but there are certain settings that when you find them, you kind of make this like, whoa, face. So today I am going to show you some of those settings that are like, whoa, the plot thickened, right? There's this SQL server's running with scissors. And I'm also going to tell you the things that a team has that makes me think that they really know what they're doing as well. There are a lot of things that I don't necessarily judge by though, because I've also had cases where I got information about the SQL server before I ever talked to anyone. And I learned over time that there are some things that seem obvious, but that you shouldn't jump to conclusions about. So for example, I've seen SQL servers where just looking right off, it looked like it was really under-provisioned for memory. But once I actually started talking to people and started looking at their specific problem, memory didn't have anything to do with their specific problem. It was related to something else entirely, and in their cases, adding more memory, it might sort of protect them from certain things that could go wrong in the future. It wouldn't be bad, but it wouldn't solve the big issue they were facing. It wasn't, as simple as it appeared to be from just first glance at an Excel spreadsheet, right? So I don't make an assumption about everything. There are some things, though, that we can tell. So first thing, what makes a team look like they really know what they're doing? I've met a lot of different teams, and there are really two big traits that a team has that make me feel like they are going to be able to capably manage a SQL server and do a great job with it. The two traits are taking ownership and responsibility for the SQL Server configuration and being willing to discuss and challenge any element of the configuration. So notice that these are not things that I can learn from the SQL Server itself. Really, whether or not a team is capable has to do with a mindset and a perspective of the team and of their whole way of working with the SQL Server more than it has to do with, facts that you might know at the time. The given configuration and things about a SQL Server that work well, they change over time and we have to adapt to them. Sometimes our knowledge is a little bit out of date. Sometimes we inherit a SQL server that has all sorts of crazy things going on in it. But the things that really make a team able to handle whatever comes at them are taking ownership and responsibility and being kind of willing to change things and being willing to be wrong. Absolutely, that does not mean that they just listen to what I say and are willing to change anything right away. That it's actually, that taking ownership of your configuration means that when someone says you should change something, you want to talk to them about, oh, well, why is this going to help and how can I measure it and make sure it's going to work well, right? Because you own that configuration and you want it to be the best that you can. So these two traits are really what make me say, oh, okay, here's what can make the situation better, and sort of know that they're going to run with it and be able to do a great job with it over time. Now, this is a little harder than it seems. There's a litmus test you can take. So, okay, does my team have these traits? One quick way you can kind of do an evaluation right now is, do you ever find yourself or your team saying or thinking things like, oh, well, there's no way that I can do this thing because I can't get money for it or permissions for it or resources for it. If this kind of statement of, oh, well, there's no way we can get more memory, or there's no way we can fix the indexes, or there's no way we can get a new, upgrade our SQL Server because we just can't, then that is a setting that you really don't have this perspective that I'm talking about. Now, most of us, in fact, almost everyone, there's the occasional exception, but almost everyone can't just do whatever they want with the SQL Server. There are limits with budget. There are limits with permissions. There's limits with what you can get from other people in your environment. It isn't that you'll be able to do whatever you want, whenever you want. Most of us don't live in that world with the SQL Server. But if you have this mindset of the capable team, then whenever you want to do some of these things, your approach is to say, well, I haven't been able to do this in the past, but if I'm going to identify the changes that I think will make the biggest difference. And for these changes, I'm going to find scenarios where I believe this change would make an improvement with the SQL Server. And I'm going to identify specific cases where it would help the business. I'm going to figure out how to measure the current state and how I'm going to try to predict what doing my change would improve, and then see if I can test it out. Maybe I can, maybe I can't. But I'm going to make a case for my change, and I'm going to talk to my manager about figuring out when we can present a proposal to do this to business owners. Now, my proposal may not get accepted, right? Maybe we don't have money for this now. Maybe we don't have the resources to do it. But if that's the way it turns out, that's cool. I'm going to wait and to see over time if more incidents happen that this would help. Then I'm going to say, okay, we've had this incident and this team is unhappy and this customer is unhappy. Could we revisit my proposal to do X? I think it would make this easier. You've got your case built, right? So this is about a mindset to make things better, even in the face of not always getting to do it. That's really what the capable team is about, is they keep on trying, even when they can't do everything, and they're always asking the question, how can I do this? What are the benefits? What are the risks? And what are the costs? So really, when a team has that approach, that's the team where I'm like, okay, well, you may need a few knowledge pointers. You may need some help troubleshooting a specific issue, but you've totally got this. And the cool thing about that mindset is, even if you don't have it now, even if you've sort of gotten into this mental reactive team space where you're always like, we can't really make anything better, you can change that and you can fix that. You're going to have to really sort of retrain yourself and prioritize the biggest things you want to do, and make yourself start asking, what can I do? Question, and being persistent even in the face of being told no. But that is something that you can do, and if you change it in yourself, that behavior can actually spread among your team. It's very, very cool. So what about just looking at the SQL Server? Been talking about team traits. There are a few things that just looking at the SQL Server, I don't make a lot of judgments necessarily about the team because, like I said, this SQL Server, who knows where it came from? They may have acquired it. It may have literally been sitting in a closet and nobody knew about it, right? Like this. So I don't make any assumptions about the current database administrator until I talk to them because there's always the chance that this wasn't their doing. But there are some settings with the SQL Server that are a little bit of a cry for help. So let's talk through what those are. One is having priority boost enabled. Priority boost is a setting that you can set up in SP configure. And it's a real old legacy setting. And not only is this setting deprecated by Microsoft, but the books online entry, like if you look up the setting, it says in the documentation on the page that doing this can drain resources from essential operating system and network functions, resulting in problems shutting down the SQL Server or using other operating system tasks on the server. So in other words, Books Online basically says if you enable, if you raise the priority of the process, you may screw up Windows and your networking, right? Like that's terrifying. So having this on is sort of like when you see that this is on a SQL Server, it's kind of like when you walk outside and you look at the sky and the sky is green, like you're like trouble is coming because if this is on, there's usually like a bunch of other random stuff that's set to weird things and you're going to have to kind of be really careful looking for odd settings because this one Microsoft is pretty darn clear about. Just don't. Another big warning sign is when processor affinity masking is configured. This is usually a sign that the SQL Server is not properly licensed. Some folks get the idea that if they use affinity masking to tell the SQL Server to only use certain cores, that they only have to pay for licensing those cores. This is not the case. With SQL Server, if you're running it in a virtual machine, you need to license all of those virtual CPUs. And you can do licensing for virtual machines either at the guest level or you can license at the host level. If you're not virtualizing, you have to license at the host level. And when you're licensing at the host level, you have to license all of the physical cores in that server. All of them. So, processor affinity masking, whenever I see that that's been configured, I'm like, we may have to have this awkward conversation about, did you pay enough for your SQL Server or are you in violation of the licensing rules? Another tricky bad setting, when you find that jobs are backing up a transaction log and they're throwing away the log backup. They could be doing it via truncate only or no log. Those are the older commands for doing this. They could be backing up the log to disk equals null. This one happily is becoming more rare, but I have found it a few times. Microsoft actually removed the syntax for backup log with no log, backup log with truncate only. I think it was SQL Server 2008 that the syntax doesn't even work anymore. But they left a backdoor, which is backing up the log to a disk location of null, like essentially dev null. When you find this, it means when you're doing this, you're essentially saying, I'm going to take a transaction log backup, but I'm not really going to take it. Just throw the log backup away. And the reason that this is so problematic is you're actually doing the work of a log backup and making SQL Server think it has log backups. But if you don't want log backups, you should just be in the simple recovery model where log backups aren't required, right? Like throwing away a log backup is breaking your transaction log backup chain. If you don't want log backups, be in a different recovery model and don't do log backups. If you do want log backups, you want them all, like every single one of them. So So this is a really concerning thing to find. Usually when I've found it, people have had a problem and they were searching on the internet and they didn't really understand the code that they were implementing it. A fourth sign that the SQL Server is running with scissors. Auto shrink is enabled on one or more databases. And the funny thing about this one is, I've actually found this one quite a lot. It's not uncommon to look at a SQL Server and find at least one database with auto shrink on it. I mean, it's not, I wouldn't say the majority, but I found it way more times than I thought I would. And usually people know that they shouldn't have auto shrink on. Start chatting with them and either they're surprised that it's on or it's on a database that they say doesn't do much. And you can you can see how much I/O a database does at least. But even if a database doesn't do much, you want to have it off because it can kick on, it can cause blocking, and if you're having a performance problem, you don't want the possibility that auto shrink is part of it, especially because it is so well documented that auto shrink can cause blocking and cause performance problems that it's kind of a lot of egg on your face. When I find auto shrink on, it's usually a sign that the team is in really reactive mode or they have a much bigger environment than they can properly manage because they just haven't had time to even kind of figure out the best practices of, hey, this setting is bad for performance. Finally, the fifth sign that the SQL Server is running with scissors is having multiple instances of SQL Server installed in the same Windows environment when performance matters. SQL Server will let you do what's called instance stacking. I can have one install of Windows, in other words, either a virtual machine or, just an install of Windows. And I can install multiple SQL Server instances in it. They can even be different SQL Server versions. I can stack them. The problem is, this is a real nightmare to manage when performance matters. It's like having an apartment, a small studio apartment with multiple teenagers living in it, and they're all sharing one refrigerator. And sometimes any one of those teenagers can eat all the food in the refrigerator, and then the other teenagers who are hungry all complain and can't get any food until you figure out how to get some of the food back from that guy who ate it all. And I guess the teenagers can't really go shopping for themselves. The metaphor breaks down at a certain point. But essentially, Microsoft, they let you do this instance stacking, like it will install, but they don't make it easy to manage it all. You've got all these different versions of the SQL OS in each instance vying for resources and competing. If you care about performance, a better approach, you can do a couple different things. You could consolidate the instances into one SQL Server instance. So you've got one SQL OS who is scheduling all of those resources and managing the memory instead of multiple fighting. Or if you do need to keep the instances separate, maybe for performance or maybe for permissions reasons or because they can't all be on the same SQL Server version, the approach that's going to work better for performance there is virtualization. Get them all their own apartments. And this will scale much better too because you can have multiple hosts when you have a lot of these different apartments and you can balance things out in a whole environment. So when I find multiple instances in the same SQL Server install, it's usually a sign that people are going on outdated information, or they designed the environment based on outdated information before really the rise of virtualization, and virtualization became really popular as a way to manage this. So what if you're in the situation where you're like, oh man, I think we may be guilty of some of these configurations, or I don't know, right? What if we've done something that's kind of a big warning sign? Well, I'm not saying any of this to shame anyone. And it's not a personal failing at all. I was once a DBA in an environment where we, I think it was we installed a new SCOM management pack. This was a long time ago. I'm like, what did we even do? I think it was a new management pack, and it revealed that we had auto shrink on a couple of databases, and none of us were aware that we had auto shrink on. So if you're like, well, I'm not positive, or I think I may have egg on my face, this is really just, it means you have a prioritization problem. It does not mean you're dumb, or at least not any dumber than me. So I don't know if that's comfort, but take that as you will. What you really want to do at this point is just immediately say, okay, how can I get some time to check out my SQL Server configuration and inventory? What are my current settings? What looks like it's low-hanging fruit to change and improve? Or even some of these things may not be really quick to improve. If you've got a lot of instance stacking and performance is important, that may be a bigger change that takes a long time to plan. But you want to talk to your manager about really saying, okay, I need some time to really look at our architecture and our settings. Check out some of the free tools online. There's a couple of different scripts out there that are totally free. Brentos Unlimited has the SP Blitz script in their first responder kit. SQL Skills has free diagnostic queries for different versions of SQL Server. Test those out in a dev environment. See what you like best and what works well for you, and then get permission to run them in production. Work through what you find and prioritize changing things as a result. Absolutely don't just start changing the settings. If you don't have a change process, I actually on my blog have a free change control template that you can use to get started, and you can work towards making sure that nothing about your SQL Server says, hey, we're running with scissors. Thank you so much for joining me this week for Dear SQL DBA. This has been a really fun question to talk to you, so thanks so much, Perceptive in Pittsburgh, for this question. I am actually going to be traveling soon. I'm going to SQL Saturday, Washington, D.C. I'm giving a session this Saturday morning. So if you're in the D.C. metro area, I would love to see you at my session on troubleshooting blocking. SQL Saturday is totally free. And then I will be visiting my family in the region after that. So I won't be doing an episode of Dear SQL DBA next week. And I've got a lot going on in December, but there should be hopefully 2 more December episodes. We'll see what I can do. Thanks so much. I'll talk to you soon.